We are continuing our timeline concerning the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And we have explained in previous talks in this series how from the beginning of history the concept of the lost 10 tribes and the tafkid, or the task the lost 10 tribes would have, had been determined. It was ingrained in the very creation of man and woman, of the first man and woman, of Adam and Eve, how they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. And after that we had the Tower of Babel that followed shortly from the flood. And Noah, the three sons of Noah, gave rise to all of humanity. It was Shem, Ham and Japheth. From Shem came Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob. Jacob was also known as Israel, and Jacob gave rise to 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. These were the tribes of Israel. And the tribes of Israel went down to Egypt, and they were brought up out of Egypt by Moses. They were delivered from subjection in Egypt. They were led through the wilderness. In the wilderness they received the Torah and the commandments, and they continued. And then Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim, they conquered the land of Canaan. And they settled in the land of Canaan. And we had the period of the judges, followed by the rulership of kings, King Saul, David and Solomon. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam, or Rehoboam in English transliteration, became king, and the northern 10 tribes rebelled against him, and led by Jeroboam in Hebrew, and Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, they set up their own kingdom. The 10 tribes set up their own independent kingdom of Israel in the north. And later this kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. It was conquered by the Assyrians. The 10 tribes were taken into captivity, and they were led away. They were led away into captivity, and there were two major pathways, one could say, of exile. One pathway was by way of sea. They were taken in ships manned by Phoenicians and Philistine, and Minoan, so-called Minoan sailors and navigators who had maritime enterprises in the west. And these groups took Israelites to the west. They took them to the area of present-day Spain, Portugal, also to Ireland, to Britain, Scandinavia, and the northern coastlines. Or if they did not take them directly there, they took them to nearby regions, hence from whence the Israelites moved to the areas we mentioned. The main bulk of the Israelites had not been taken overseas, had been taken overland. They went to the area on the present-day Iran, northern Iraq, Syria, the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, all of that region, and they were settled there. And in those areas they became part and parcel of the Cimmerians, Scythians and Goths, who were a combination of other peoples who federated with the Israelites, and the Israelites became identified with them, and there was wars, and there were different changes in the situation, in the international situation. Eventually the Israelites were expelled or pushed or moved to the north. They moved into what is now southern Russia, and from there they moved westward into Europe. They became known as the Germanic and the Celtic peoples, and they conquered that region. We're not saying that everyone amongst these Germanic and Celtic peoples and Scandinavian nations were of Israelite descent. We're saying that the Israelites were amongst them, and that is where they have to be searched for. And in these regions they became tribes in their own right. So that is what we are dealing with in the moment. What happened to the Israelites after their exile? It is worth noting that meanwhile, after the Israelites had been taken away, that only the tribe of Judah remained. Judah, that is the kingdom of Judah, inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah, which comprised the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, most of the tribe of Levi, and also a representative minority portions of the other tribes, or refugees from the other tribes, would also attach themselves to Judah. From this kingdom of Judah was destined to emerge the Jewish people as we know it. And the Jewish people remained in Judah until according to conventional datings, about 586 BCE, they were conquered by the Babylonians, and by stages they were taken into exile in Babylon. They were taken to Babylon into exile, and in Babylon they remained, they developed, until Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And the Persians allowed the Jews to return. They did not force them to return, they allowed those Jews who wished to return to do so, and a minority did go back to the land and begin to rebuild it, and they rebuilt the temple, and they began to develop the area, and by stages more and more Jews added themselves onto them, joined them, and they also increased and multiplied until they became an important entity. The kingdom, not the kingdom, but the province of Judah, under autonomous rule of the sages, who later became the authors of the Talmud, and they developed an internal society which had great internal wealth, and spiritual developments, and intellectual training, and a communal life of their own. And this was a pattern that was to continue throughout Jewish history up until the present day. So this too is worth noting. The Jews were to develop along their own lines, and this too had been part of the divine plan for the Israelite nation. The Israelite nation had two major tasks. One task was to develop the Torah, to live a life according to the Torah, and the other task was to civilize humanity and to become a great kingdom in their own right. And when originally they were supposed to do this as one unity, and to do this one together, and to enforce the rule of righteousness over all the earth. But they were not up to it, they couldn't do it, the world was not ready for it, neither were they, so the two sections of the Israelite nation had to split in two. One half became the Jewish people who developed the Torah, as we now know it, the Torah and the Torah law, but they were subject to other peoples, and the other half became the 10 tribes of Israel, who forgot who they were, who became like the pagans, who devolved, degenerated, became like the pagan nations around them in almost every sense. But there was something there, something of the Israelite soul remained within them, and they over the centuries evolved upwards. They became more and more civilized, one could say, whilst enjoying the blessings of military power and material wealth and prosperity. And they have in a sense, they have bequeathed to all of humanity a sense of being humane, or the need to be humane. They have made the animal called man into a spiritual being to some degree, as far as was possible, and they have also evolved, developed themselves. Now we are reaching the end times when the two sections of the Israelite nation have to once again reunify, and the two aspects of human development have to become one, have to be merged together. But we're getting ahead of matters. Now we have to see how the tribes were in their places of exile. They had been taken into exile. A section of them had been taken by the Assyrians to the north, into the Caucasus areas. In this region they became associated with the Scythians, or they became identified as Scythians, and also Cimmerians and Goths. The Cimmerians at an early time moved to the west and gave rise to Celtic Civilization. Afterwards the Scythians and the Goths also moved in the same area, in the same direction. They moved from the east to the west. One of the things was, in the west they established dolmens, megalithic monuments, which are similar to those found in the land of Israel, very similar, identical to those found in the land of Israel, one could say. And these monuments, these megalithic monuments, show a proof of Israelite ancestry. They describe a pathway of migration, and this had been predicted in the the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, according to the Hebrew version and the rabbinical commentators on this book, that they would set up a pathway of migration, they would set up megalithic monuments that would show the way they went in, and that in the end times we have to use, or may use this pathway as proof of Israelite ancestry. And so we had the history of Western Europe as we know it. Originally there were people who set up megalithic monuments, and they became the Celts, or the Celts merged with them. They had the Celtic Civilization, and on to Celtic Civilization came peoples from further east who spoke Germanic languages or Scandinavian type tongues, even though they were not Germans in the sense that we understand Germans to be. They were Israelites, but they had shared Germanic culture, and they had aspects of German, one could say, German institutions amongst them, and they, as well as having influenced the Germans. But most of them were not Germans, and they left. They were united or federated with Germanic groups, but they divided themselves. But even though they divided themselves, many Israelites remained in the area of Germany until in the 1700s and 1800s, the great migrations to the USA led to the evacuation, led to the peoples of Israelite origin separating themselves from their neighbours and moving out and going to join the Israelite brothers in the USA and in Australia and in related nations. And similar phenomena occurred all over Europe, and the studies have been done on this, even studies comparing the physical types and names and families and so on, showing that there is something to what we are saying, that there was a definite difference between those who left and those who stayed behind. And those who left were of different ethnic origins from those who remained. Meanwhile, the Jews were in the land of Israel, and the Jews were in Babylon. Babylon was the Babylonians had been replaced by the Persians by the Greeks, and the Greeks set up the different hybrid elements in Syria and in Egypt and so on, and they ruled over the kingdom of Judah for a while until the Jews rebelled and had the Maccabites who rebelled. The Maccabees rebelled against them, and they established a degree of independence until the Romans took over, and the Romans eventually destroyed the Second Temple, destroyed the Jews, and forced the Jews to leave. And this began to increase the diaspora that had already existed, that had already begun under the Babylonians, and intensified the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews, and the Jews were scattered all over the earth, even though there was always a concentration of Jews in Islamic countries and in Christian areas. So this is also important, and this was also part of the divine plan for the world and for the Jewish people and the Israelite nations. And we had, in Northern Europe, we had the Israelite peoples, and the Israelite peoples were there, and they were in these regions of Northern Europe, and we can trace, as we have shown in our book, The Tribes, we can trace how different groups bearing names that are similar or identical with the Hebrew names of Israelite tribes, or with clans within that tribes, how groups whom we may identify as belonging to Israelite tribes tended to coalesce, to rejoin together. People from one tribe would reunite, as if to say, and not only would people from one tribe reunite together, but peoples who are descended from Israelite tribes who in this land of Israel had been neighboured, adjoining one to another, also tended to reform this pattern of settlement in the West. And we can show parallels to this as a repetitive phenomenon that may be proven from historical sources, and it is proof of divine providence. It is proof of Israelite ancestry. along with the hundreds and thousands of other proofs that we have, this is also an indication, and it is an indication not only of Israelite ancestry, but of a divine providence directing everything and doing everything according to a plan that had been foreseen and that had a purpose behind it. And we identify groups that settled in France as belonging to the tribes of Reuben, Simeon. We find scattered, we find some of Simeon amongst the Jews, but also many of them amongst the 10 tribes in different areas, some in France, some in northern Italy, some amongst the Celts, amongst the Welsh, amongst the Irish, and so on. Issachar we find amongst the Swiss and also amongst the Finnish people. Zebulun amongst the Dutch. Holland was peopled by a people known, according to Ptolemy, as Sabulin Goy. Sabulin Goy means Goy. Zebulun, people of Zebulun. The very name testifies to the Israelite origins. Also it had been prophesied that Zebulun would dwell on the shores of the sea, and the Dutch people in the Netherlands are the only people in the world who do literally dwell on the shores of the sea. 2/3 of the Netherlands is below sea level, and it depends upon dikes and waterworks and so on to prevent flooding from the sea. And it has reclaimed, in effect, reclaimed sea land. Literally, these are the shores of the sea, and this is where Zebulun is found to dwell. The Danes, we find the Danes in Denmark. Denmark is named after Denmark, is named after Dan. We also find Dan elsewhere, somewhere in Ireland, somewhere elsewhere. We find Naphtali amongst the Norwegians. We find Gad amongst the Swedes in Sweden. The Goths. Goths and Gad are different ways of pronouncing the same name of Gad in Hebrew. We have Ashur, who we find both in Scandinavia and in Ireland. And these are the Israelite tribes who we find divided in the north. The tribe of Joseph. Joseph gave rise to Ephraim and Manasseh, and Joseph was to be also throughout the west, but concentrated in the British Isles, with Manasseh being more to the north than to the west, and Ephraim more to the south than to the east. And from the areas in which we find elements from Manasseh came an overwhelming predominant proportion of the early settlers in North America, especially in the USA. And this confirms identification of the USA with Manasseh according to other criteria. So that, in a nutshell, is what happened to the Lost 10 Tribes. This is illustrated on the timeline by Sylvia Halpert. I am Yair Davidiy. I've been speaking to you from Brit-Am, the biblical region of Bethlehem, in the land of Israel. May the Lord God of Israel bless all of you. Thank you.